Their closest friends couldn't believe what you just did. Archangel Michael says, the room held its breath the moment you stepped through the door, and even the shadows seemed to lean closer to hear your next move. You carried a silence that felt like thunder, a quiet that made every heartbeat in the house sound like a drum. You had already made the decision, and the decision had already changed you. They had gathered because rumors moved faster than light. Your name had been on every tongue, your choice dissected, judged, and misunderstood before anyone had heard the full story. Their faces revealed the glow of screens and the chill of disbelief, like spectators at a miracle they did not approve of. You stood by the window and let the city's soft noise steady you. The night looked like a velvet curtain pinpricked with 1,000 small promises. Your pulse matched the distant hum of traffic, and your courage matched the gravity of everything at stake. No one expected grace. No one expected the kind of mercy that rewrites a history book in a single stroke of ink. But you did not come to argue your case, you came to embody it. They could not believe you forgave the one who had done you harm. They could not accept that you had chosen love over vengeance and restoration over ruin. They could not imagine that the door you closed behind you was the doorway into your future. The room was a museum of tight jaws and bristling shoulders. Pride arranged itself like weaponry across folded arms. Doubt played chess moves on every face, trying to corner you into retreat. But you had already surrendered the fight they wanted. You had surrendered it to something larger than the scoreboard of petty victories. You had surrendered it to a light that sees beyond the last insult and the last wound. The announcement was simple, and simple things terrify complicated hearts. You would not press charges, though you had the right to do so. You would not ruin a life to prove a point, though the point could have been proven with a single signature. A hush fell, and you felt the hush fall through you too, like a curtain drifting down after the final scene. You were not performing, but somehow it felt like applause now lived in the stillness. Somewhere inside you the future shifted, and you felt the ground rise to meet your feet. They remembered the months when your eyes were made of rain. They remembered the messages unanswered and the meals untouched and the nights that clenched your ribs like a fist. They remembered that you had every reason to return fire with fire. Instead, you returned warmth to a cold season. You returned softness to a place that had sharpened you to survive. You returned to the person you knew you were before pain tried to rename you. This was the act that set the room ablaze without flames. You released the claim that tied two souls to the same storm. You stepped out of the thunder and into the clear air of your own sky. One friend gasped, and the gasp traveled like a rumor through the bodies of everyone present. Another friend muttered that you had lost your mind. A third found the wall important enough to study intensely, refusing to let your courage rearrange their cynicism. You did not flinch. You remembered the weight you carried last year, the weight that made your hands tremble as you read the evidence and counted the losses. You remembered the choice that looked like a cliff, and the whisper that told you you would grow wings on the way down. Forgiveness was not forgetting. Forgiveness was remembering differently. Forgiveness was finally telling yourself the truth: you deserve to walk away free. You had already done the hard work in the quiet, so the loudness of disbelief could not uproot you. You had cried the secret tears, and those tears had watered a field where new life could take root. You had rehearsed the moment not as theater, but as a promise to your lungs to breathe easy again. The person who hurt you stood a few steps behind the crowd, looking like a storm stranded on dry land. Their apology had been awkward and broken and late. But it had been real, and you had seen something living struggling under the wreckage. Your friends did not want to understand. They wanted justice to look like a punishment they could measure in headlines. They wanted a trophy with your name on it and your victory carved into the side. You wanted something else. You wanted your mornings back. You wanted your nights back, and the sacred quiet in the middle of both. So you spoke in a voice that felt like toast cooling on a quiet kitchen table after a long night. You explained nothing beyond what was necessary. You offered no footnotes for people who had memorized the wrong chapters of your life. The city lights softened, and even the clock seemed to click more gently. You felt the release travel through your shoulders, as if invisible hands had lifted a boulder from your back. In that moment, you learned the architecture of relief has skylights. Someone said you were too kind. Someone else said you were naive. But you knew the difference between surrendering to a lie and surrendering to a truth that carries you forward. You were not making room for the harm to return. You were making room for the you that had been waiting to come home. You were choosing a legacy larger than the harm that had tried to define you. It would have been easier to accept their applause for a different kind of ending. It would have been simpler to take the path lined with nodding heads and loud approval. It would have earned you compliments from the crowded chorus of wounded pride. You chose the quiet chorus of healing instead. You chose the echo that the future would send back to you years from now, when you could walk into any room and feel the ground steady beneath your name. You chose a victory that cannot be posted but can be lived. Later, they would repeat the story with voices scraped by disbelief. They would say you did the unexpected. They would say you did the impossible. They would leave out the part about the long night where you learned your courage by candlelight. They would skip the detail about how forgiveness stitched your breath back together. They would forget the way your hands stopped shaking when you finally let go of what was starving you. You did not forget. You kept the memory as a lantern. You kept it as a compass that points to a north written inside your chest. The person who harmed you did not suddenly become a saint, and you did not suddenly become a fool. You became yourself again. And that is the scandal nobody could absorb without their old frameworks cracking. Your choice was not a denial of the past. It was a declaration of your future. It was a statement that pain would not be your last author. It was a vow to stop feeding the fire that had already eaten enough. The room emptied slowly, like a tide pulling back from rocks that had grown used to the crash. Whispered evaluations trailed behind departing footsteps. The windows watched everyone go, and you watched your breath return to your body. When the last door clicked, a softness unfolded across the floor. You sat down and placed your palms on your knees, an old ritual you remembered from a calmer time. You recognized yourself in the quiet again. Outside, the wind changed. Somewhere, a siren scaled down into silence. Somewhere else, a train stitched two neighborhoods together and kept going. You had decided to return the money you could have taken in damages. You had decided to sign away the headline and keep the peace. You had decided to leave the court with your dignity rather than exit with a trophy that kept your hands too full to embrace your life. It shocked them because your gesture exposed how little they believed in the freedom you were claiming. It shocked them because it asked whether they were ready to release their own grudges. It shocked them because courage makes ordinary rooms feel like temples. Later that week, you gathered the letters. You burned the copies that kept you chained to old scenes. You kept one sealed envelope with a single page, a statement of truth signed by you alone. You did not owe anyone a theater of suffering to prove you had been hurt enough. You did not owe anyone a tour of your scars to justify your choice. You owed yourself a chance to build a home in your own ribcage. You could have moved out of the city to escape the memories. You could have changed your number and vanished into a new language. You could have wrapped your heart in steel and called it wisdom. Instead, you changed the story while staying. You changed the route you took to the same places, and the route changed how the places felt. You changed the music you played in the kitchen at dawn, and somehow the light obeyed. People don't easily accept goodness when pain has been the playlist for too long. People grimace at mercy because it sounds like a language they were never taught to speak. People fear that if you heal, their reasons for staying broken will lose their shine. You did not argue with any of that. You let their disbelief swirl and settle like dust caught in sunlight. You kept walking. On the third day, one of your closest friends returned. Their face had softened by degrees. Their eyes held a shy admiration disguised as practical questions. You made tea and leaned against the counter. You explained how the decision came not from pressure but from clarity. You explained how clarity feels like standing barefoot on a wood floor warmed by morning. Your friend listened and found their breath again. They asked for nothing, demanded nothing, measured nothing. They only nodded with the kind of nod that means a heavy door is opening somewhere inside. They left with a different silence than the one they came with. Your house felt larger, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. Outside, a child laughed, and the sound walked right in through the open window and sat down on your couch. In the days that followed, the story kept changing in the mouths of others. That is what stories do when people are not ready to let them mean what they actually mean. You gave up trying to manage it and picked up the work of living instead. You noticed your sleep grew deeper. You noticed your appetite returned in small, honest ways. You noticed colors had names again. You walked by the river and counted 10 shades of blue you had never named before. You watched a heron lift out of the water and rewrite the air with its wings. You felt your scars soften into something like weathered leather, strong and lived in. No miracle erased the past. The miracle was your posture toward it. The miracle was your refusal to keep bowing to it. You knew there would be moments when the old ache would visit like an uninvited guest. You knew some conversations would still sting even when your mouth stayed calm. You knew the path of mercy has gravel, not carpet. You kept walking. You kept your eyes on the next simple, good thing you could do. You kept faith with the version of your name that did not need an audience to be true. The person who harmed you learned to live with the gift you gave. They stumbled and tried again, which is what people do when grace has unsettled their excuses. They began to understand that being spared is also a responsibility. You watched from a distance the way a lighthouse watches, present without intruding. Your light did not chase ships, it stood where it belonged. It let those who needed it find their bearings. One afternoon, you passed the cafe where your friends often met. The windows framed familiar faces. When they saw you, a few smiles unfolded like origami birds returning to flight. They invited you in. The conversation was awkward for a moment, then found a gentle rhythm. No one demanded a revision of your soul to make them comfortable. They talked about work and music and the weather that could not decide which season it wanted to be. You listened, and you noticed how normal can feel like a revolution after chaos. You laughed once, and the laugh sounded like you. In the corner, the friend who had been most outraged sat very still. Their hands were a nest for a warm mug they had forgotten to sip. Their eyes studied you the way a traveler studies a map that has changed. When you stood to leave, they stood too. They offered a few words that arrived like simple stones placed in your palm. Those stones looked like respect and sounded like a new beginning. You walked home through streets that had taught you how to survive long before they taught you how to rejoice. You noticed a mural you had never really seen, even though you had passed it 100 times. It showed a door floating in the sky with a small staircase leading up to it, one step drawn in chalk beyond the others. You understood. You had climbed a step that did not exist until your foot made it. You had trusted the air to hold you, and the air had remembered that it was made by someone who knows how to hold. The text messages cooled from wildfire to campfire. The calls slowed until they felt like invitations rather than interrogations. The story of you found a quieter narrator. You cleaned your kitchen and your contact list with equal care. You chose new recipes and new boundaries. You placed a small plant on the windowsill and promised to water it like a future. At night, you learned how to befriend sleep again. You put your phone face down and let the dark be kind. You listened for the hush that tells you the day has approved your presence. You practiced telling your story without the heavy parts carrying you like cargo. You practiced standing tall in rooms where you used to fold in on yourself. You practiced saying no with a tone that felt like a handshake with your own spine. There were still those who wouldn't believe it. They needed you to be a cautionary tale to support their devotion to anger. They needed your life to prove their theory that tenderness is weakness. You blessed them by leaving them to their conclusions. You blessed yourself by staying faithful to your own. You blessed the future by refusing to keep the past on life support. Eventually the gossip exhausted itself. Even storms grow tired. Even waves decide to rest. The person who harmed you found a quiet path of repair. They apologized to others without turning your choice into a stage prop. They did the small work that does not make noise, the kind that actually builds something. Your friends learned. Your city learned. You learned most of all. You learned that the strongest thing you can do is place your heart back in your chest and walk forward. You learned that winning is sometimes a release rather than a triumph. You learned that joy respects those who make room for it. You still defend your boundaries, but you do it like a gardener protecting a tender shoot, not a soldier guarding a ruined field. You still remember, but you remember with light. You still hurt sometimes, but hurt now has a door to exit through. Weeks later, there was a gathering none of you could avoid. You dressed simply and wore the calm you had earned like a quiet medal under your shirt. The sky was a silver bowl, and the city's edges glowed. They watched you enter, and their eyes performed the same mathematics they had done before. But the answer had changed because you had. You greeted them with a steady warmth that refused to calculate the cost. Someone congratulated you on an opportunity you would not have noticed before the breaking. Someone else asked for your advice with a tone that held genuine respect. In small ways, the world had moved to meet the shape you had become. When the night ended, a friend who had said the harshest things walked you to the street. Their words were careful, like a bridge testing its first steps over a river. They told you they were wrong. You did not punish the confession. You let it land and live. You nodded and placed the moment somewhere safe inside. You went home and sat by the window where everything began. The city gave you its necklace of lights again. You wrapped the necklace around the present and called it beautiful. This is what you did that no one believed. You made a choice that broke the arithmetic of revenge. You made a choice that put breath back in your future. You will keep choosing it, not because it is easy, but because of how it feels when you wake up. You will keep choosing it because of the way your name sits sweetly in your own mouth now. You will keep choosing it because your life is large enough to hold the past and still have room for a sunrise. And when people ask years from now why the air around you feels like a blessing, they will not be able to believe the simple answer. You let go. You let go, and the letting go held you. The story will live in every small kindness you do next. It will live in the way you pay attention when someone is telling you where it hurts. It will live in the way you never again mistake fury for strength. They still talk sometimes, but their closest friends now cannot believe how you stayed. They cannot believe how you walked out of the smoke without needing to drag anyone back into it. They cannot believe that your peace did not lose its shape under the weight of their disbelief. Believe it anyway. Believe it because you lived it. Believe it because the ground beneath your feet is steadier than the noise above your head. Tonight, the city rests and so do you. The clock knows your name, and the future has kept your seat warm. You close your eyes and feel the pages turning, gentle and sure. A new chapter does not ask permission from the last one. It simply begins. And you have begun. If you wish to express your support further, you have the option to give super thanks, with contributions